Early morning light filtered weakly through a veil of mist, casting soft shadows over the city's tall buildings like memories half-formed. The sound of footsteps echoed against the stone steps of the courthouse, but Isla Marin no longer heard them. Her heart had sunk into a deep, freezing void. 30 days in jail. Her younger brother, Evan, just 19, had been sentenced for assault after a fight outside a bar, but Isla knew the truth was far more complicated. Evan had been defending a friend who was being harassed, and in the chaos he had punched another boy. A boy who unfortunately turned out to be the son of a powerful local politician. The incident was quickly spun, manipulated, and used as an example of upholding the law in a courtroom dripping with ambition. Isla stood in disbelief, as though the world had turned its back on her. She had raised Evan since he was 10 after a tragic car accident had taken their parents. For years, she had worked as a waitress at a tiny downtown cafe, scraping together extra hours by teaching dance to elderly women at the community center. Not for passion, but to pay rent, cover school fees, and buy medicine when Evan got sick. Every dollar she earned bore Evan's name. She had never lived for herself, only for him, as his guardian, his sister, his everything. And now, the boy she had sacrificed her youth to protect was being thrown into one of the coldest places imaginable, a county jail. Isla had nothing left but desperation. No money, no legal contacts, no miracle on the horizon. Only one name lingered in her mind, a man from her past. The only one with the power to help, even if the cost might be nothing less than her soul. Julian Thorne. The Thorne & Co. Tower loomed like a pillar of glass and frost. Silent, towering, and cold. Isla stood beneath it, staring up at its mirrored surface, reflecting a slate-gray sky. She didn't belong in this world of black suits and hard lines, but she had nowhere else to go. Julian Thorne. The name once carried warmth in a forgotten corner of her childhood. She was only 10 when her parents died in a car crash. She and her baby brother were placed in a state shelter. The early days there were a blur of unfamiliar beds, quiet sobs, and meals eaten in silence. Julian, then just 13, was the first person to make her smile again. He was a quiet teenager who volunteered at the shelter every week. Never loud, never boastful, just a boy with a sketchbook and a calm smile. Isla, shy and broken, would often sit nearby, watching him draw, curious about this older boy who seemed like he belonged somewhere far away. One day she asked, "Aren't you scared of being alone?" He'd smiled faintly, then shook his head. "No, I'm only scared of not being needed." She remembered falling silent. Before he left the shelter for the last time, he folded a paper airplane and slipped it into her hand. "If you're ever in trouble," he'd said, "come find me. I'll help." 15 years had passed, she had never forgotten. Now the office door opened, Julian walked in. No longer a boy, but a man made of sharp edges and quiet power. Still, those eyes, they were the same. Colder, but just as deep. "Isla Marin," he said with a nod. "It's been a long time." She swallowed hard. "I need help." Julian listened, not interrupting, not reacting. "My brother's been sentenced to a month in jail. If I don't act, he won't make it." A beat of silence. Then he said evenly, "I'll help, but not for free." "I don't have money," she said quickly. "I don't want money." His eyes didn't flinch. "I want your time." 30 days, living with him, appearing by his side, a shadow in his world, no sex, no touch, but everything else on his terms. Isla stood frozen, but she had promised herself, for Evan, she would do anything. The penthouse sat atop a sleek glass tower in the heart of the city, spacious, modern, flawless to the point of coldness. Isla stepped inside the silent space like a guest wandering into someone else's life. Everything was exquisite, from the pale gray rugs to the abstract art on the walls. But to Isla, this was not a home. It was a luxurious cage. From the very first day, Julian laid out an unspoken set of rules. She had to be impeccable, punctual, and accompany him to every social function. A private driver, a personal assistant, and a limitless credit card were handed to her like tools to mold her into whatever image he had in mind. Isla didn't protest. She nodded, obeyed. Deep down, she was just counting the days, serving out her 30-day sentence. But what shocked her most was that Julian kept his word. 3 days in, Isla received a call from the courthouse. Evan's sentence had been converted to community service. Even more, he'd been offered a placement at a nonprofit, quietly funded by an anonymous sponsor. Isla didn't tell her brother the truth. She simply forced a smile and said she'd landed a new job. Something a little unusual. At night, as the city lights spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Isla would lie curled on the sleek leather couch, staring out at the skyline, trying to justify the choice she had made. Every corner of the apartment was silent, perfect, and devoid of warmth, much like the man who had brought her there. Julian was rarely around during the day, but when he did appear, he was unfailingly polite. No harsh words, no inappropriate advances, only a silent control that pressed on Isla like invisible chains. She didn't know what game he was playing, but one thing was clear. Inside this glittering apartment, Isla was not free. Time passed in the apartment like a song on repeat, structured, rhythmic, but soulless. Isla played her role to perfection, always on time, dressed elegantly, smiling politely as she stood beside Julian at lavish dinners and gallery openings. She learned to nod at the right moments, to smile softly when expected, and to stay silent when it mattered most. But inside, she was exhausted, utterly drained. Julian, by contrast, remained composed and unreadable. He commanded rooms with his gaze, left impressions with every firm handshake. Yet sometimes, when Isla caught glimpses of him alone, gripping a wine glass, staring out into the distance, she saw something else. A quiet loneliness, carefully hidden, never spoken. One night, after a particularly dull fundraiser, Isla returned to the penthouse ahead of him. Drained, she kicked off her heels, turned up the music, and began to dance alone in the living room, the only act that still made her feel alive. She didn't know Julian had come back. He stood by the doorway, watching silently as she moved between shadows and light, dancing like freedom itself. He said nothing, didn't interrupt, but in that moment his eyes were no longer cold. A few days later, in a rare moment of stillness, Isla found him reading a book of Pablo Neruda's poetry in his study. When she walked in, Julian began to read aloud, a quiet verse full of longing and sorrow. His voice was deep, unpretentious, yet achingly sincere. They spoke for hours. Voices low, like a secret shared only under starlight. About poetry, about pain, about how words had saved them more than once. In that quiet space, something unspoken began to shift. That night, they weren't businessman and contractual companion. They were two weary souls, sitting close, reaching for a flicker of warmth. Isla began to see Julian not just as the man who had bought her time. He was someone who had once been hurt, who had once loved, once dreamed. And despite every instinct to guard her heart, she began to feel something stir, softly, but undeniably. Amid the glittering galas and the long, silent nights, something began to shift between Isla and Julian. No longer just polite glances or tense silences. They were reaching something deeper, unnamed, yet undeniably present. Julian was no longer a distant figure in the penthouse. He began to reveal himself in fragments, his knowledge, his quiet empathy, the unhealed wounds beneath his flawless suit. Isla, without meaning to, started waiting for him each evening, started scanning the room for his eyes. But she kept reminding herself, this was a contract with an expiration date. Then came the mountain retreat. Julian said he needed time away for legal matters and invited her along. Isla hesitated, but deep down, a part of her longed for space, away from rules, away from expectations, and perhaps toward something unnamed growing between them. The chalet was warm, quiet. For the first time, they were alone without cameras or curious eyes. Isla saw a softer version of Julian, and their conversations deepened, touching on fears, memories, hopes they had long buried. Then, one night, while snow blanketed the world outside, the security alarm blared. Julian's team confirmed signs of a deliberate break-in attempt, not random, targeted. The intruder had bypassed a high-level system. Julian reacted swiftly, decisively. From that moment, everything changed. Isla was no longer allowed outside without an escort. Her phone was screened, her days were pre-approved by Julian's staff. He said it was for her safety. But Isla felt the lines had blurred. She was no longer being protected, but confined. "I'm keeping you safe, Isla," Julian said, his voice trembling with concern. "You're keeping me caged," she whispered, her disappointment raw and unfiltered. Leo's unexpected visit came just in time. Isla told him everything. He listened, quietly heartbroken. "You deserve a love that's open," he said, "not one kept behind locked doors." That night, Isla stood by the window for a long time, watching snow fall like silent questions. Her heart ached. She had once promised to do anything for Evan. Now, she had to do something for herself. With trembling hands, she packed a small suitcase and left a note. "Thank you for saving Evan, but I need to breathe. I need to live. And love cannot grow where there is no freedom." In the days after Isla left, Julian Thorne moved through his life as if a part of him had vanished with her. He still worked, still signed contracts, still ran his empire. But something in his gaze had gone hollow. His words became mechanical. The meetings, a soulless loop of routine. For the first time in years, Julian felt truly lost. The apartment was too quiet. He sat in his office that night, the contract still on his desk, creased, unsigned, yet heavy. He picked it up, read the line about 30 days. Then, for the first time in years, he whispered to no one. "I wrote this because I thought control could protect me, but it only made her run." And then he tore it in half. The paper made no sound, but something inside him cracked wide open. He didn't chase Isla. He didn't call, he didn't send people to find her. Instead, he did the one thing he had never learned to do. He stepped back. And he waited for a chance to make things right, not through power, but through sincerity. No one knew that Julian had begun secretly funding scholarships at the community center where Isla once taught dance. He donated to youth art programs in her old neighborhood, every donation signed by a silent foundation. No recognition asked. The one who brought him back to Isla was Leo. He came to Julian to say thank you, and instead of anger, Leo listened quietly as Julian spoke about control, regret, the truth that he had loved Isla in the wrongest way possible. "You don't need grand speeches," Leo finally said. "But if you truly care about her, don't let her only memory of you be a golden cage she had to escape from." A week later, after Isla's dance class ended, she looked up and saw Julian standing at the far end of the room. No flowers, no rehearsed apologies, just him, silent, steady, and waiting. She froze. The studio was nearly empty now, the last echoes of music fading from the mirrors. For a moment, they just looked at each other, like two people meeting after a long journey through different storms. Then Julian stepped forward, not with urgency but with care, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I'm not asking for forgiveness, I only wanted to see you dance. You're still the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and if one day you ever need someone to listen, I'm still here." Isla didn't speak, but her eyes shimmered. She didn't run to him. She didn't look away either. And that was enough for now. They began talking again. Simple texts, quiet calls, no expectations. One day, Julian invited her to watch a small performance by kids from her new dance center, the one she had founded, the one he had funded anonymously. Isla understood then, love doesn't need grand gestures. It needs time, trust, and choice. A month later, she moved in with Julian, not in the towering penthouse, but a small beach house he had bought, where she could see the sky each morning and fall asleep to the sound of waves. They married in a quiet ceremony with only a handful of loved ones. Leo walked her down the aisle. There were no fireworks, no sweeping dresses, only Isla's whispered vow as she stood by Julian's side. "This time, I stay, not because of any contract, but because I want to." 5 years later, Isla had become a celebrated choreographer, and Julian, the man who once only knew how to lead companies, was now a father, a husband, and a quiet patron of the arts. They lived in a sunlit home where their daughter danced barefoot in the living room and their son snuck Julian's poetry books into school. That evening, Isla folded a scrap of sheet music into a small paper airplane, just like the one Julian had given her at the shelter all those years ago. She handed it to their son. "If you're ever lost," she whispered, "find the one who taught you how to fly." Julian heard her and smiled with tears in his eyes. One windless afternoon, Isla leaned her head against Julian's shoulder as they watched their children play in the garden. Their daughter twirled barefoot in the living room, a ribbon wrapped around her wrist, spinning the way Isla used to, in that same living room years ago, when she danced alone with music loud and pain buried deep. Julian watched her quietly, then turned to Isla. "She moves like you did," he said softly, "when you didn't know I was watching." Isla blinked, emotions catching her by surprise. "And now?" she asked. "Now," Julian replied, "I never stop watching, but this time, not to control. Just to remember how lucky I am." "Do you still remember that 30-day contract?" she asked with a soft laugh. Julian kissed her hair. "Every detail," he whispered. "It was the most foolish decision I ever made, and the one that gave me everything. Because some love stories begin with rules, but the real ones begin with freedom."